You just said you believe the conflict between Israel and Iran is over. What makes you so confident it is?
Because I dealt with both, and they're both tired, exhausted. And can it start again? I guess someday it can. It could maybe start soon. I think the war ended actually when we hit the various nuclear sites with the planes.
I think it's very, very ill-advised for a president of the United States to claim that a war is over when it has only just begun. Now, he may well believe that. That's a possibility. I can't imagine it because I think we're at the start of a much longer period of conflict. Now, how long it will last and what the outcome will be, I don't know. But to make that statement strikes me as walking out on the very edge and trying to jump across the chasm, on the assumption that you're going to make it in one leap. I just don't think so. So that's the first thing. I wouldn't have said it. But then again, this is vintage Donald Trump. Secondly, his description of what actually happened is very confusing and incoherent. First of all, it's not true. I think that's the most important thing to mention. And that's something a president should avoid. You just don't want to be caught in a position of saying something that is not necessarily true. Sometimes I get the impression that President Trump says things and believes that he can wish them into reality. If he says it boldly and long enough, then ultimately it will come true. But that's rarely how it works in international relations. So we did not destroy the nuclear development capability. That's nonsense. It's now well established. And again, Boomer TV will tell you, yeah, it's absolutely done and wonderful, and we're on our ways the up and up, but it's not. So I wish I could say something good along the lines of God bless the president. He's done a great job and we're off to the races, but we're not.
Yeah, Doug, they are hammering home that narrative of success, complete success, obliteration. And he even went further, and obviously he was asked about that today, and he went further discussing, in fact, so many of the different parts of the administration, whether it be Witkoff, whether it be Marco Rubio, whether it be Hegseth, they're all saying, in fact, very little different things, but all details they're getting into as to how things unfolded and the success that they had. But let's go back to the commander-in-chief and what he had to say about what transpired.
Is there any indication from U.S. intelligence that Iran was able to move any material, including
No, just the opposite. We think we hit them so hard and so fast they didn't get to move. And if you knew about that material, it's very hard and very dangerous to move. It's called, in many people, they call it dust, but it's very, very heavy. It's very, very hard to move. And they were way down, they're 30 stories down. They're literally 30, 35 stories down underground.
I think you got it all.
Oh yeah, we think it's covered with granite, concrete, and steel.
Doug, they're getting into details more and more as they go along here to finalize this narrative, it seems.
Well, it's not going to make any difference because the narrative is going to be exploded in the future. We know that those sites were effectively empty. Now, did the Iranians with 2 hours notice manage that? I don't think so. I think that the Intelligence Committee was either blindsided or we just ignored it. President Trump has a habit, which is, by the way, not unique to him. LBJ engaged in this sort of thing. I think you've got to accept the fact that if he doesn't like it, it doesn't fit his agenda, that he'll simply, hand wave it off. And I think that's what happened. He decided to believe whatever the Israelis provided, I suspect, through their minions in the White House. And he said, fine, let's go do this. It didn't make any difference. And it hasn't ended the war. It hasn't stopped anything. Those are the facts. Now, there's something else. An old friend of mine who is now retired, who served in Vietnam as well as in Desert Storm, and then subsequently retired in the late 1990s. He called me immediately and he said, as soon as the president or anyone else stands up and starts to tell you our great servicemen and our military and on, how great they are and they're the best, he said, immediately step back. He says, you're about to listen to a load of bull. And what they're interested in doing is distracting everyone from what actually happened. And how many times have you listened to Hegseth, Rubio, Trump, over and over and over? Oh, no one else could have done this. We're the greatest, and on and on and on. Okay, fine. We have an old expression, nonsense talks, but performance walks. And
That's a nice way of saying it.
I think this is a mistake to do what he's done. But whatever. I think we're at war with Iran. That's not over. Iran is still at war with Israel. Israel is absolutely at war with Iran. And for that matter, increasingly the whole Muslim world.
Doug, you said something. You said it quickly, and I'm afraid that it's getting glossed over. It sure stood out to me, and it still stands out to me how Trump took the advice or took the intel from Israel, completely ignoring, at least from what we can tell on the surface, his own intel, his own intelligence community. How much does that bother you?
Well, it's not surprising. As I said, LBJ did that sort of thing. Several presidents have. A good example of someone who didn't, interestingly enough, is Richard Nixon. He talked to Kissinger. This is before the strategic arms limitations talks and before we completed any of the agreements that emerged from those talks on arms control. And Nixon asked Kissinger, what do you think? Do you think this is real? And they were looking at the intelligence assessments that had been provided by the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And Kissinger said, I'm not confident they're accurate. Now, these painted a picture that was not only ominous for the whole world based upon what they were imputing to the Soviets, but it turned out that it also was largely inaccurate. So Nixon said, well, listen, let's check this. And Kissinger said, I'll do it. So what Kissinger did, which I think was very, very smart, is that he brought to Washington the station chiefs across Eastern Europe and in Central Asia that were, Turkey in particular, that were watching everything that the Soviets did in terms of their nuclear stockpile and nuclear weapons development. Brought them to the White House. They got into a room with Kissinger and they came out with a completely different assessment. And ultimately, the result was the strategic arms limitation talk. So in that case, Kissinger and Nixon recognized this is not necessarily the director of the CIA lying in that case. It was more a question of the status quo bureaucracy in Langley that produced one answer, and the answer that came from the field where people dealt with this every day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, was different. But you're talking about Nixon and Kissinger. They wanted to achieve something, with the Russians, and they were absolutely determined that they were going to find a way to do it, and they were smart enough to question, whatever came out of the bureaucracy. Mm-hmm. Now, in this case, President Trump decided he didn't like what he was being told, and he was going to go ahead and do what he thought was appropriate, and I think he placed a lot of trust and confidence in what the Mossad said.
And at the same time, demoralizing his own team.
What do you mean team? What team? What team is he demoralizing?
Oh, I just let's say the Tulsi Gabbard, the CIA. I mean, go down the list of the Larry.
Wait a minute. Don't assume that Radcliffe had any problems with this. I think you've got to go and look at Blumenthal's most recent article where he talks about Radcliffe as the Mossad stenographer. Sitting in the CIA. No, I think we've got a lot of people who are compromised, and that's just one example. I think probably the only person that pushed back at all was Tulsi Gabbard,
right? And but only for a while, right?
Well, I mean, you've got to make a decision. Are you going to push back and then make this an existential decision? Either you believe me, or if you don't and you press ahead with this, I can't support it, I resign. Or do you say, whoops, okay, boss, I'll stay on board. And apparently she decided to stay on board.
Yeah, it was no hill for her to die on, I guess. Let me flesh it out a little bit more, because Trump explains even more his thinking and what all is going on and what he foresees going forward with Iran in this case.
Are you interested in restarting negotiations with Iran? And if so, have they reciprocated?
So our people, Marco could answer, but our people are not, I'm not. The way I look at it, they fought, the war's done, and, I could get a statement that they're not going to go nuclear. We're probably going to ask for that, but they're not going to be doing it. But they're not going to be doing it anyway. They've had it.
Doug, when I hear that, it's almost like he's declaring their surrender for them. And it's like, well, that dog don't hunt.
Well, the Israelis fully expected that Iran would collapse within the first 24 to 72 hours under the weight of their initial airstrikes. And
Hammering, yeah.
Then Ben-Gvir, a few days later, admitted publicly what nobody in the Israeli government or anywhere in the Israeli media would admit, which is, gosh, we underestimated the Iranian arsenal. We didn't appreciate it. And that's why they came to us immediately, said, you've got to get into this war. You've got to bail us out. You've got to help us. And I think Donald Trump wrestled with that because obviously his donors want him to do that. And he's the prisoner of his donors to a large extent because they put him into the White House. You can't ignore them. But on the other hand, he really doesn't want a war. So he opted for what I think, in retrospect, will be seen as more of a PR stunt, a staged event, political theater, call it whatever you want. And these strikes, were announced before we went in. We told them we were coming in 2 hours. There was no, as far as I can tell, pushback from the integrated air defense systems. No missiles were fired. I don't know if they turned their radars on or not. I'm sure they have the radar cross-section target form for the B-2s and everything else anyway. They're not a secret and haven't been for a while. So I don't know, but I think that's basically what happened. And what's dangerous now is that he's imputing to this a steady state outcome. Right. The truth is, and he let it slip very briefly. If you listen to the remarks, well, it could happen again. In other words, this could break out again. Yeah, it could break out tomorrow. It could break out in 6 weeks. It could break out in 2 months. We don't know. And right now, we know that the Israelis are running out of cash and missiles. And I'm sure we're trying to send them everything we possibly can. By the way, we have fired hundreds of missiles from our destroyers in support of the Israelis and their air defense against incoming Iranian missiles. We're about out. Our ships have to go back to port to reload. I know that our THAAD battery on the ground has had to fire virtually everything it has. There was an article that came out, I think, within the last 24 hours in a trade magazine where a representative from Raytheon admitted that we've got a real problem with rocket motors. And it affects certain classes of missiles. I think it's the Standard Missile 2, Standard Missile 6, can't remember, also AMRAAM, a number of missiles out there. Well, that's because we don't manufacture the rocket motors. We manufacture components. We're dependent on external sources for the rest of it. And he was simply saying, I don't think we can do much quickly. And then we had this business of 600 missiles a year. We've managed to increase that to 660 a year that we can manufacture. Listen, that's not going to work. You know, we want to be a great power. We want to be a superpower. Trump likes to grandstand about that. Well, I better find out what happened to the manufacturing base. When are we going to build a manufacturing base that can keep up? That's something the Russians and the Chinese don't have a problem with. We've got a serious problem with it. So all of these statements are ill-advised, these public statements from him.